Good morning, everyone. Welcome to WOMAG's Coffee Catch-Up. This is our first catch-up for 2024. Thank you so much for registering and for coming this morning. So we're going to record, as you see, we've started recording already because we actually, and this is a record for us, we had over 100 people registering, but we only have a capacity of 100 for our Zoom meeting. So unfortunately, we could not accommodate everybody. So we've recorded this session and we're going to upload it on our YouTube channel, and also we'll share the link on our LinkedIn page. So if you want to revisit it later, you can always visit our LinkedIn page and check out the link. So my name is Prelia Moenandar. I'm Head of Government Affairs for ASEAN for Corteva Agriscience. I'm here with my friend Pranav Setaputra. He's the comms lead. He leads communications in WOMAG. And thank you, Pranav, for supporting me on this call. So today we will learn about the carbon markets, why it's important, what are the challenges, what can be the solutions. This is hardly a new concept. Actually, I think you've probably heard the term carbon markets being discussed like for a long time already, but it has increasingly become a hot topic since the COP26, when leaders reached a compromise to finally prep the policy for international stage at the Glasgow meeting. Before I hand it over to our speaker, I would just like to share a few housekeeping rules. Please keep yourselves on mute for all times, at all times during the call. And anytime during the presentation, if you have any question to Jade, please just put it down in the chat box. We'll visit it when we do the Q&A later. And if you prefer to ask your questions directly to Jade live, just raise your hand. There's by clicking the reaction button on the bottom of your screen, and then I'll ask you to unmute yourself later during the Q&A. Before I go ahead and introduce our speaker, we would like to understand you, the audience in this room, the level of your expertise or level of your knowledge about carbon markets. So we'll appreciate Pranav's help to launch the poll, Pranav. So we just want to have a better idea of the audience and also the level of your knowledge so that Jade can speak to the level of the knowledge in the room. We'll give it a few seconds for people to provide their answers. And Pranav, let me know if we have most of the responses already. So
will do, Prelia. We have about 70% done now. So I think if you're comfortable, I'm happy to close it.
Yeah, I think let's say I think 70% is representative of the majority. Okay. So most people in this room are from food and agriculture and forestry sectors. We also have more people from private sector and some from NGOs and others. And most of the people have either basic or intermediary knowledge of carbon markets. That's good. Jade, for full transparency, I'm one of those people with basic knowledge of carbon markets. To be honest, like that basic knowledge I got from researching about this topic when I was asked to be moderator. So please, if you have any like technical terms, appreciate if your help to elaborate more. Okay, thank you for participating in the poll. Without further ado, let me just introduce Jade. So Jade Feinberg is the director of ESG at KPMG. She's an expert in carbon market and sustainability with experience over 13 years. She has extensive experience in clean development mechanism, climate change strategies, and carbon markets. She has worked within private and public market alongside governments, multilateral institutions, companies, private investors throughout Africa and ASEAN. So Jade, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Prelia, and nice to virtually meet everybody. So I'm going to share my presentation. I'm going to walk through some of the concepts around carbon markets, but I look forward to questions and we can make it quite interactive as well. So don't feel shy. Don't feel free to ask questions. I've got some of my colleagues on here as well to also answer any questions that you might have. So if we start in terms of carbon markets. So carbon markets, are we at a crossroad? What does it look like? So to give some background, I started in carbon markets in 2009. And my experience to date over the last 13 or so years has been quite interesting because I, to be frank, didn't expect carbon markets to come back alive after the price tanked in around 2010 and the carbon markets sort of fell flat. And I'm talking more of voluntary carbon markets and the compliance carbon markets. Compliance carbon markets in the EU and California are well developed and they have been going for some time. But from a voluntary carbon market perspective, the industry really went quiet for a long period of time. And it's quite nice to see it revitalized again. And not only revitalized, but taking quite...
So sorry for interrupting. Do you mind putting your slides on presentation mode?
Oh, it's on presentation mode, my side. Hold on. Did that work?
Now we've lost your your slides.
Okay, hold on. Let me try that again. Okay, so you can see the slides, and then did that go to presentation mode?
No.
No.
Yeah. Or if it's not possible, just make it probably bigger so that people can see it better.
Okay.
Yeah,
Let me try
that's
one more
frustrating.
time.
Technology, right, has a way of doing this.
I know.
Yeah.
Pranav, any technology tips that you might have to help this?
Yeah. Are you using two screens by any chance?
I'm not. I'm on one laptop.
Okay.
And are you sharing your whole screen or just the PowerPoint app?
Just the PowerPoint. Should I share
Okay.
my whole screen? Would that work?
I think that might be easier. Let's just do that.
Okay, let's try that.
Okay, and then hit
How did that go?
Perfect. Thank you, Jade.
Okay, fantastic. So from where it was in, say, 2009 and the kind of evolution to where we are today is quite exciting, and hence why Crossroad, which I'll take you through the presentation, is that even though we'll go through some of the challenges, it is moving forward. And there are lots of ways in which this is happening. There is still clarity that needs to be had in the market for various reasons, but it's quite different from a voluntary market that we saw in, say, 2009 under the Clean Develop mechanism to where we are today. And that is, I want to say, progress, and something which we do need to give credit to the carbon markets as a developing infrastructure, developing standard frameworks, regulations, etc. So the three discussion points I'd like to cover today is: why is the carbon market important to our global decarbonization journey? What are the challenges with the carbon market and what are the potential solutions? And then how is Singapore playing in the carbon market, given we are based in Singapore at this point in time? So if we look at financing for climate mitigation and removal projects, there is definitely a financing gap. And the carbon markets actually started off as a way to crowd in financing into markets and projects that wouldn't ordinarily obtain that financing due to the various risks in the project or the country where the project is based. And hence, this is called additionality, which is a very big concept in carbon markets to prove that the additional subsidies, if we can call carbon credits the subsidies, to tick your project over the line of becoming feasible is worthwhile and proves that you need this financing, otherwise your project won't go ahead. And that's the concept of additionality. So if we look at the funds that are going to be needing to flow into carbon removals, such as direct air capture, what we call DACs or BECCS, bioenergy in terms of carbon capture and storage, or carbon removal, even carbon removal in terms of nature-based solution. These are really big sums in terms of billions of dollars per year that need to be invested for these types of solutions to go ahead. That in and of itself makes many of these projects additional because a normal balance sheet from an organization wouldn't fund these projects without that carbon credit subsidy to go into them to make them feasible. And these are the types of projects that we're seeing come to the fore, I want to say more and more. Renewable energy used to be a carbon credit project, but now the additionality considerations for renewable energy type projects has changed quite significantly, because most renewable energy projects now are feasible and therefore easily fundable, because the proof of concept of solar, wind, hydro, for example, banks understand them. So when I did my first solar ground-mounted facility in Africa, it took quite a lot of education of both the debt and the equity funders to get that project over the line, because 12 years ago, a solar ground-mounted in Africa wasn't much of a proof of concept, whereas now it is. So this is also how the industry is changing in terms of what projects are considered for carbon credits, what projects are now considered feasible and not additional, and then how do we move that forward. And with each of these type of projects, when we look at removal and mitigation, climate mitigation, adaptation, they all have very specific methodologies that need to be followed. They're quite mathematical, they're quite scientific in terms of how the carbon removal is calculated, and therefore, again, proving the additionality and proving the permanence of that carbon removal in the carbon value chain going forward. So carbon market is part of the solution, we believe, particularly to help channel financing to the carbon markets. If we look at Southeast Asia, 15% of the world's tropical forests are located in this part of the world. And this region, therefore, can contribute to $10 billion in sales of carbon offsets. So we're sitting in a hub of potential when we look at Southeast Asia, and not only from a forest perspective, but from a nature-based perspective. So one of the other topics I cover with a colleague of mine at KPMG is biodiversity and nature. And we really sit within a biodiversity hotspot in the world. So how do we not see it as conservation, which is particularly, say, philanthropic up until today, but really an investable universe which can help corporates and organizations and governments not only conserve the ecosystems that we need as human population to survive, but make it also profitable to ensure that these projects can also go ahead and the funds get allocated to de-risk those potential projects, which is what the carbon markets try to do. They try to de-risk the investment. So the carbon markets have been significantly growing from, say, 2021 to 2020. From 2020 to 2021, and it has continued to grow even as of today. And that's because there's a lot of market forces and regulatory forces that are coming in to put more structure, even if we look at the Article 6 discussions, which are government level. It wasn't, say, definitive at the end of last year, but we are hoping and we are still seeing movements forward, even though the finalization of some of those discussions at COP at the end of last year didn't result in what we would like to say success in terms of a carbon market view. The growth of the carbon markets is also set to be exponential over the next couple of years, particularly when we start looking at organizations' decarbonization journeys and how they are committing to fight climate change, and how they're committing to also finance some of these projects maybe beyond their value chain, which is sort of a new topic that's under discussion and on the table. So regardless of these, call it movements forward and the requirements that we believe the carbon market meets, there are challenges which are very real, and the private sector, I want to say, is quite cautious about due to reputational, potential legal, potential financial risks that could bring, particularly because of what has come out in the media of late. Private sector don't want to have their names splashed on the front pages of any headlines. So how do we make sure that the carbon credits that get bought are integrous, they are credible, they are permanent? How do you ensure that you are investing in projects in jurisdictions that are stable as well? And when I say stable, that if they commit to being a participant within the carbon market, you're certain that year on year, given the long-term investment of a carbon project, you are going to get your carbon credits year in, year out, and there's not going to be governmental policy changes. So how do you ensure that stability as well? And then most importantly, how do you ensure that there's no double counting? So if I buy a carbon credit, you want to be sure that no one else is buying the same one and retiring that. So that transparency and consistency in terms of registry and traceability is another piece as well when we look at the integrity of carbon credits. The complexity of measurement and verification. So if we look at some of the forestry projects or REDD+ projects, from a biodiversity and nature perspective, every tree or every seagrass or every shrub doesn't remove carbon at the same levels. So how do you actually measure that project if you're looking at a type of nature-based solution to actually accurately verify the carbon credits that are coming out of that? So the methodologies that are put in place by the likes of Vera and Gold Standard assist on that, and there's more and more happening in terms of the blue economy now as well, and they're trying to do that with REDD+, but that also becomes quite complex. So some of the ones which are in place and getting quite a lot of attention are the mangroves, but then you've got other projects like cook stoves. So cook stoves are very good when we look at the health of the humans who are using the cook stoves in various rural areas. But there's been a lot of questions in terms of measurement and verification of the cook stoves, which brings into question the integrity of the carbon credits that come out of that, and therefore the price that you might be buying that carbon credit at. Another one which is always a topic is the price and the volatility. So how would you put a price to the various projects? Largely, it's made on the measurement and verification. It might also be decided by the jurisdiction, the type of projects. So there are many factors that come into this price. But in terms of then also the price volatility, that is something that comes into question depending on media reports, depending on regulation changes, the standard bodies, and where the market is moving towards. And that uncertainty can affect investment decisions, especially when you're building out your financial models and trying to get investment to crowd into various types of carbon projects. The last one would be the fragmented marketplace. So there isn't a globally unified sort of stock exchange, if we could call it like that, which would put into place that transparency that we all would say experience in a stock market. Because of that fragmented marketplace, it's additional uncertainty, if we can say that, because there's these carbon credits are traded over the counter unless an organization invests directly into a project and that project becomes your, say, centerpiece where you get your carbon credits out of. So that unified marketplace is something that organizations and some governments are also trying to put into place, but it's a long process, and there's lots of considerations that need to be taken when putting that what we call in the carbon markets registry in place for the traceability and ease of use of users. So the headlines in the last week or two have been quite something when it comes to putting into question the carbon credits. One of which was the SBTi announcement, which got a lot of media attention for various reasons, just about 10 days ago. So what we do see is that journalists and the media, as well as allegations from people inside the industry, come out, and it really shakes things up, and it really makes the users of carbon credits even more cautious or uncertain, because they don't want to be involved in any greenwashing scandals, we could potentially say, because of the commitments that they've made publicly and disclosed, and especially if an organization is listed in a jurisdiction and comes under quite a lot of regulatory scrutiny. That's not something that you would want because of the liability that comes with it. So the misuse of carbon credits, the allegations of misappropriation of funds, all these pieces actually deviate from what the carbon markets are trying to do. And even though it uncovers and takes the hood off to really look under it, that's where people in the industry are trying to say, how do we keep this market integrous? How do we keep the project developers integrous and do the right due diligence to make sure that the carbon credits that are coming into the market are credible, integrous, and not open to misappropriation and scrutiny, if we can say that. So various standards are emerging to help this, create this transparency, trust, integrity. So we've got the ICVCM, so lots of acronyms in both sustainability and carbon markets. But they published the core carbon principles. And now these core carbon principles are trying to do exactly that. They're trying to, the same way as the VCMI published the Claims Code of Practice, they are trying to create trust, credibility, comparability between credits, so that the users of credits can say, okay, is this stamp, which is what core carbon principles are doing, it's sort of a label. If this carbon credit has this label, can I trust it? Does that mean this is something that has been verified and vetted outside of a standard body like Vera or Gold Standard? And therefore, that label gives me comfort that I can put my trust and my investment into this project or into these credits. The SBTI, which is separate to the announcement that was made about 10 days ago, but they've released something called Beyond Value Chain Mitigation, which is very interesting, where it looks at, so if I take the cook stove example, cook stoves not only have a carbon benefit to the environment, but they also have a health benefit to the user. So if we take the beyond value chain mitigation concept, someone who is maybe in pharmaceuticals, who provides healthcare to individuals, they might be interested in a cook stove project because that forms part of their value chain. It might prove part of their, say, scope 3 value chain. So if they invest in a cook stove project to have the environmental benefit, they are also having a human benefit which goes to their business model and ethos, which is to call it, say, save human lives or increase healthcare for humans and individuals. So the beyond value chain concept is becoming quite interesting. And I think even if we look at the agriculture sector, soil sequestration, the biodiversity challenges, the nature-based solutions, et cetera, how does the agri sector use this beyond value chain concept to invest in carbon-related projects which have an environmental benefit, but beyond that, it will also have a biodiversity and social benefit, which is part of the value chain, impacting the farmers, for example, or impacting the consumers. So this is a concept which is, call it part of your scope 3, but it's an aside to that because it's more aligned to your actual business model and your BAU, aside from the environmental benefits that you would be getting from the carbon removal. The last one, which is quite a recent piece, is the EU has agreed to develop the world's first voluntary certification framework for carbon removals, including carbon farming. So this one would be very relevant for the agriculture sector. And it's something that I implore you to look into a little bit further. It would also tie into what the SBTI is looking at in terms of beyond value chain mitigation. And therefore, these concepts work quite nicely together, not only within the EU, but with outside of the EU, if you are starting to play and import or export into the EU, the same way as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism has done, as well as the EU deforestation regulation, which we're seeing more and more come into Asia, ironically, than happen in the EU, because the companies based in our part of the world would like to and hope to stay competitive in the EU. And therefore, these regulations, these frameworks become more important to business being conducted and operations in ASEAN than potentially operations happening in the EU jurisdiction itself. So finally, to wrap up, I guess you could say, is what is Singapore doing in terms of being a carbon hub? So the Climate Impact X was launched, and that's a global exchange for voluntary carbon credits. And in essence, that's a brokerage type system. You could say it's a type of stock exchange for carbon credits where they will list projects. So if a project is listed on Climate Impact X, you expect the due diligence to be done for you. And therefore, when you go onto their platform, you buy a credible, integrous credit, depending on your price point, depending on the type of project that you would like in the jurisdiction that you would like. Then you've got Gen Zero, which was founded by Temasek and is an investment firm. And Gen Zero invests in projects with a nature-based solutions focus, but also technology-based solutions focus, and not only within ASEAN. So they invest in Africa, they invest in Latin America, they invest in projects that are quite also cutting edge to see how to develop the ecosystem, not just from traditional views, but to take the industry forward, if I could say that. So it's a traditional investment firm, but with quite a different focus when it comes to carbon mitigation and carbon adaptation, particularly when you're looking at Article 6 and government-to-government discussions. You've got the Monetary Authority of Singapore, who have launched the ESG Impact Hub. And this is also creating this ecosystem space around Project Greenprint in terms of digitalization, in terms of how to innovate the sustainability sector to drive ecosystem startups, technologies, innovations to, again, move the industry forward from where it is today in innovative ways. And another one they're piloting is transition credits. And transition credits, they've got some pilots in our neighboring countries to look at how to transition away from coal into more renewable types of energy. And that's being piloted as well. And it's quite an innovative concept. And then finally, the Singapore government is working with the World Bank on a project called Climate Warehouse. And Climate Warehouse is, in essence, a big global registry of every carbon credit in the world and tracking how it transfers. So if I'm Singapore and I produce a carbon credit and I choose to sell it to Japan and Japan chooses to sell it to somewhere in Dubai, et cetera, you'll be able to track the sale and also the price to be able to give yourself more knowledge of where the credit comes from, but also how it's been traded in terms of pricing as well. And this is really to increase transparency, but more importantly, it's to minimize double counting so that one carbon credit, because one carbon credit in the US is the exact same carbon credit in Australia from an atmospheric perspective. How do you make sure that that carbon credit is used once and once only, and then it gets retired? I think finally for Singapore, which is what I want to almost say the world is watching, is Singapore is signing MOUs, bilateral agreements, and now they've actually moved to implementation agreements with multiple countries in terms of Article 6. So the most recent one, which was announced, is an implementation agreement with Papua New Guinea. The next ones are coming would be Cambodia, Vietnam, Peru, Bhutan, Ghana, and multiple others. These bilateral agreements and implementation agreements help to facilitate trade of carbon credits between these countries, where Singapore has provided the overarching framework in the hope of crowding in investment into these emerging developing markets. But also after that, if you are committed and obliged to pay carbon tax in Singapore, those credits from these markets where implementation agreements have been signed can be used to offset 5% of your carbon tax obligation in Singapore. What it means for other countries around the world who are, say, in a developed world position, Singapore has a reputation of being a compliant, regulatory, transparent, and stable market. And hence, by Singapore leading the charge on these implementation and bilateral agreements, it gives comfort to other markets, potentially, that Ghana, Bhutan, Peru, Vietnam, Cambodia, Papua New Guinea, etc., have been vetted, and a type of stamp of approval has been given by Singapore to develop carbon projects in these markets. So it's creating, again, what Singapore is creating by all these 5 points is an ecosystem for carbon, an ecosystem for trade, an ecosystem for financing, and an ecosystem for innovation to move things forward. With that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand back to Prelia.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jade, for that. I learned a lot and a lot of technical terms. So I think most people are still digesting the information, but we actually have several questions here. So let me start. Let me just go straight to the questions from the audience and start from the topmost question. So the first question is from Prachi. Her question was, what are some of the successful NBS projects that have been integrated into carbon markets?
So some of the successful ones are mangroves. There's quite a few mangrove projects in ASEAN, I believe as well in Brazil and other parts of the world. So mangrove seems to be one of a key, say, focus. There's also a very big blue economy project in Africa, which has seemed to be successfully done. And that is one which is listed on CIX. And that was seen positively because of the nature of blue carbon and the desire to buy those type of credits. I do have to say, though, the price point for those projects is quite different, and it is higher because of just purely demand and supply. So the demand for a blue carbon project is seen higher than others, and therefore naturally drives the price up.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. Thank you for your answer, Jade. And thanks, Prachi, for your question. Next question from Afni. How can we ensure the verification of the NBS project within the carbon markets?
So when it comes to verification, there are verification bodies. So if we look at the traditional cycle of a registration of a carbon project, you will get a third-party verifier. So a project developer will take the project and the technical design document of that project based on the methodology that comes from a Vera or Gold Standard. They will submit that in, but then they have to get a third-party verifier before that project gets registered. Like a traditional financial audit, I guess you could say. And then once that project is registered based on that third-party, call it verification stamp of approval, every year, that project will need to be verified and audited before the carbon credits get issued. And that helps to say that if your baseline was 100,000 on your initial registration, are you sure that every year you've got 100,000 carbon credits? Or is that baseline maybe incorrect and now needs to be relooked at? So that verifier will come in annually to give credibility and comfort to the market that those carbon credits actually took place.
All right, great, thank you. Another question from Prachi, but Prachi, I hope you don't mind if I go through another question since you already asked a question. I'll get back to you later. So another question from Sangeeta. Are there strict criteria and requirements in place for companies to qualify ahead of accessing carbon credits to prevent abuse?
So no, there's not. So if you are the company purchasing carbon credits, there's not a policing body at this point in time. So if you are a organization that wants to retire them for your own use, or you are a trading organization, so someone who's got a carbon trading desk, both are the same and you can buy. One will buy it, say, at $5, retire it, and the carbon credit disappears. A trader might buy it at $5, arbitrage all the way up to $20, $30, and then sell it. So there's not that market, how would I say, scrutiny in terms of buyers just yet.
Thank you. I love these like concise answers that you provide so that we can go to the next question immediately.
I'm happy to elaborate further though if anyone wants.
Maybe if we have time, because we have to finish at 9:45. So I'll go straight to the next question from Hendy. Any required size of the carbon project, for example, hectareage or a minimum carbon emission reduction?
So there isn't, but it would depend on the investment. So even just registering your project with Vera Gold Standard or the other standard bodies has quite a lot of costs to it. So project developers need to weigh up the benefit versus the cost. And that's where small projects now are being discussed, because how do they get the carbon credits if they can't afford the fees of registration? And there are ways now in the market of trying to diversify standards and frameworks to try get these smaller project developers through, because the amount of carbon credits, the funding which we need into these, say, emerging market projects, there's a lot of them. But if we wait for everyone to be registered with Vera, not only the cost but the timing, that causes bottlenecks in the industry. And that's something that's trying to be solved currently.
Unfortunately, we only have 5 more minutes, but there are actually a lot of questions coming in. So I don't know which one to, let me just ask the next question and see, how far you can get. Next one from Maria. Can you please explain the pricing of carbon credits? Is it purely based on supply-demand dynamics or on the intrinsic value of the carbon captured?
So the pricing of carbon credits is a very interesting one. You've obviously got the compliance market, which has its own pricing mechanism. So what I'm talking to now is purely the voluntary carbon credit. And voluntary carbon projects, I want to say, are mainly done on supply and demand, or integrity and measurement, and the transparency of the actual credit. So some projects the market doesn't feel as comfortable with in terms of how it gets measured and verified, and that transparency to ensure that actual carbon has been removed or actual carbon has been avoided. Other projects, there's more comfort. Other projects are more niche, say like a blue carbon project, and therefore the price will be higher. If we look at carbon capture and storage, for example, because of the technology behind the solution, that generally will command a much higher price, because if we look just so from a financial perspective, just to tip your project over that financial hurdle will need a very high carbon credit value to make that project feasible. So that's also where it comes in, is in terms of the financial modeling and how that potentially works. But there's not a call it intrinsic value of carbon captured, which would be different to another intrinsic value of carbon captured to differentiate the price.
Okay, great. I'll probably allow for one more question so that we can still have time for closing. Last question from, and I'm sorry to the others who, don't get, your questions don't get answered. And hopefully we can invite Jade back to another CCU in the future so that we can discuss more. The last question from Dalal. What are the most impactful NBS carbon reduction methods, and has this translated to funding?
So I don't want to say one is more impactful than the other. They've got different benefits and they'll have different implications. So what we're seeing also from a carbon market perspective is not just the carbon potential of removal, but we're also seeing the social and the biodiversity benefits. So when we start looking at these holistically, the carbon price of a project from a nature-based solution perspective might be $10, but the multiplier effect on the coastal community or the farmer in terms of agriculture might increase that impact exponentially depending on the project at hand. So if we look at in terms of funding, it will also depend what the funder is looking for. But it's not necessarily purely just carbon now that the market is looking at, because of the conversation around social and biodiversity, which is really starting to pick up steam. So the more holistic that impact is, the more that will translate into the funding that I think you would be able to get.
All right, great. I think those are, well, not all of the questions. I think we missed a few questions, and I'm sorry again to those whose questions didn't get answered. But it seems that there is a lot of interest in this topic, and maybe we can arrange another coffee catch up next time to discuss more. And so thank you so much, Jade, and thanks for all the questions that come in. And Pranav, thank you for your notes and explanations of all the terms for everyone to understand. So before we close, appreciate if you can just respond to a quick survey so that it's a post-event survey for us to help us improve, and Pranav can launch the survey before you leave. And once you've completed the survey, you can just leave. And thank you so much again for your time today, and see you at our next coffee catch up.